Bible does something most people never notice. It names giants after Noah's flood, not one vague monster in a forgotten legend. Whole peoples, cities connected to them, warriors from Gath. First Chronicles identifies one as Lahmi, the brother of Goliath. The later battle record also names Ishbi-benob and Saph, then describes one last giant with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. That does not mean the Bible says the same giant survived inside or outside the ark. It gives no biological chain running from the Nephilim before the flood to Goliath centuries later. The word after matters. Giant peoples appear after the flood, but the mechanism connecting the two worlds is never explained. And there is an immediate complication. 2 Samuel says Elhanan killed Goliath the Gittite. 1 Chronicles says Elhanan killed Lahmi, Goliath's brother. That is not a minor spelling difference. One reading threatens the most famous victory of David's life. The other introduces a second giant with a direct family connection to Goliath. And both readings lead into a final list of giant warriors associated with one city, one ancestral name, and one dying generation. So picture the scene compressed into one moment. The flood is already in the distant past. The ark rests behind history. David stands with an open record in his hands. Goliath is not alone. Another giant stands behind him, related to him, fighting with the same kind of enormous spear. The record is not telling us that one ancient giant escaped Noah's judgment. It is telling us something more precise and, in some ways, more disturbing. The giant problem returned, and when it returned, the Bible remembered names. The first name is Lahmi. 1 Chronicles chapter 20 verse 5 says that Elhanan son of Jair killed Lahmi, the brother of Goliath the Gittite. His spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, the same terrifying comparison used in the description of Goliath's weapon. But the parallel passage in 2 Samuel chapter 21 is complicated. In the traditional Hebrew text it says Elhanan killed Goliath the Gittite. Some English Bibles smooth the collision, others preserve it in a note. We will come back to that conflict, because it may reveal how one of the Bible's most famous giant stories was copied, clarified, or damaged in transmission. Before we follow the trail from Genesis to Gath, subscribe to the Buried Testament. This channel preserves the shock without turning a gap into a fact. Every week we trace names, parallel passages, manuscript problems, and buried connections that disappear when a familiar story is reduced to one Sunday school scene. Subscribe now, because Goliath is the name everyone remembers. The record contains several more. Genesis chapter 6 introduces the Nephilim before the flood. The passage is famously difficult. It speaks of the sons of God, the daughters of men, mighty men of old, and the Nephilim being on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Those two words, also afterward, have carried enormous weight. Some readers see them as a direct signal that the Nephilim continued beyond the flood. Others understand the phrase as pointing to a later recurrence of figures remembered under the same terrifying category. Still others argue that the verse is arranging events before the flood and should not be forced into a detailed post-flood genealogy. The honest answer is that Genesis does not tell us how the later giants are connected to the earlier Nephilim. It gives no hidden passenger on the ark. It identifies no wife of Noah's sons as a carrier of giant blood. It describes no giant swimming through the waters and no protected enclave outside the judgment. Those are later attempts to fill a silence. The flood account itself says that land-dwelling flesh outside the ark perished. So if someone claims the Bible plainly describes an individual Nephilim surviving the flood, that person has stepped beyond what the passage says. But silence about the mechanism is not silence about what comes next. When Israel approaches the promised land, the language of giants returns with force. In Numbers chapter 13, the spies enter Canaan and come back terrified. They speak about the sons of Anak. They claim they saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak who come from the Nephilim, and they say they felt like grasshoppers in comparison. This is one of the strongest verbal links between the pre-flood terror and the post-flood inhabitants of Canaan. It uses the same charged name, Nephilim, and attaches it to the Anakim. But even here, discipline matters. The words come from frightened spies whose report is condemned for spreading fear through the camp. They are not neutral surveyors measuring skeletons. Their grasshopper language is emotional and rhetorical. It tells us that these people were perceived as overwhelmingly large and dangerous. It does not provide a laboratory report, and it does not construct a family tree from Genesis 6 to Numbers 13. The fear, however, is real enough to stop a nation. Israel has just escaped Egypt, crossed the sea, and watched an empire collapse. Yet the report of fortified cities and giant inhabitants makes the people wish they had never left. The giants function as more than tall soldiers. They are the visible argument that the promise of God cannot be taken. Their bodies become fortresses before Israel ever reaches the walls. Deuteronomy expands the map. It speaks of the Emim, a people described as numerous, tall, and formidable, like the Anakim. It says they were also counted as Rephaim. Then it speaks of the Zamzummim, another people described as strong, numerous, and tall like the Anakim, whom the Ammonites displaced. The vocabulary shifts. Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim, Emim, Zamzummim. These terms are not always interchangeable, and the Bible does not pause to give us a modern chart explaining every relationship. Yet together they create a remembered landscape filled with unusually formidable peoples. Then Deuteronomy names a king. Og of Bashan is called the last, or a remnant, of the Rephaim. His bed, or possibly his funerary couch, is described as 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. Depending on the length assigned to a cubit, that is an enormous object. But even this famous measurement needs caution. A royal bed can be larger than the person who used it. The Hebrew term may point to a couch or sarcophagus. Ancient kings used monumental objects as political theater. The object supports Og's giant reputation, but it is not a precise medical measurement of his body. Notice the escalation. Genesis gives a mysterious category. Numbers gives terrified witnesses and the sons of Anak. Deuteronomy gives ethnic names, territories, and a king whose colossal bed became a public memory. The story is moving from primordial mystery into geography. These beings are no longer placed only in the fog before the flood. They occupy towns. They rule regions. They stand between Israel and the land. That geographical trail becomes crucial in Joshua chapter 11. Joshua attacks the hill country and cuts off the Anakim from the land. Then the text adds a detail that sounds almost like a warning placed for a future reader. No Anakim were left in the land of Israel. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did some remain. Gaza, Gath, Ashdod, those are Philistine cities, and one name in that list should stop you immediately: Gath. Generations later, when the armies of Israel and the Philistines face each other in the valley of Elah, the champion who walks out is not introduced merely as a large man. He is Goliath of Gath. Joshua had already told the reader that remnants of the Anakim remained in Gath. 1 Samuel then sends an enormous warrior from Gath into David's path. The Bible never gives us a sentence saying Goliath was the son of a named Anakite father, but the geographical connection is deliberate and difficult to miss. The old giant territory narrows into the home city of the Bible's most famous giant. This is where many retellings become careless. They leap from Anakim remaining in Gath to a complete secret bloodline. The Bible does not provide that chain. What it provides is a cluster. Gath preserves the memory of Anakim. Goliath comes from Gath. Later warriors from Gath are called descendants of Rapha. One of them is identified in Chronicles as Goliath's brother. The evidence is strong enough to establish a giant warrior family or group around Gath. It is not strong enough to name every generation back to Genesis 6. Goliath himself is described like a walking siege engine. He wears bronze armor. He carries a spear whose shaft is compared to a weaver's beam. The iron point alone is given an extraordinary weight. His shield-bearer walks before him. He does not merely challenge Saul's army. He controls the emotional climate of the valley. Every morning and evening, his voice turns Israel's soldiers into spectators of their own humiliation. His height is famous, but even that detail has a textual history. The traditional Hebrew text gives 6 cubits and a span, producing the towering figure found in many English Bibles. Older textual witnesses, including the major Greek tradition and a Dead Sea Scroll fragment, preserve 4 cubits and a span. That shorter reading would still describe an exceptionally large warrior, especially when combined with his armor, weapon, and champion status. The variation does not erase Goliath. It warns us not to build the entire case on one number. David defeats him without matching his size. That is the theological center of 1 Samuel 17. Israel sees mass, armor, and military experience. David sees defiance against the living God. The stone strikes. Goliath falls. David uses the giant's own sword to finish the victory. The champion who made an army freeze becomes proof that size cannot decide the covenant. Most people stop there. The giant is dead. David becomes the hero. The story closes, but the Bible does not close it. 2 Samuel chapter 21 returns to war with the Philistines when David is older. This time, David becomes exhausted in battle. A warrior named Ishbi-benob, described as one of the descendants inhabitants of Rapha, intends to kill him. His bronze spearhead is given a massive weight, and he is armed with a new sword. Abishai, son of Zeruiah, comes to David's rescue, strikes the Philistine, and kills him. After that, David's men swear that he must not go out with them to battle again, so that the lamp of Israel will not be extinguished. The pattern has reversed. As a young man, David stood between Israel and Goliath. As an older king, one of David's men stands between David and a giant. The war against the giant line is no longer the achievement of one shepherd. It has become the work of the warriors formed around him. Then another battle occurs at Gob. Sippai the Hushathite kills Saph, another descendant of Rapha. The name is easy to pass over, but it matters. Saph is not Goliath. Ishbi-benob is not Goliath. The text is building a group, not repeating one duel. The terror at Gath had more than one face. Then comes the line that has disturbed readers and translators for centuries. 2 Samuel chapter 21 verse 19, in the traditional Hebrew text, says that Elhanan, son of Yare-oregim the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, whose spear shaft was like a weaver's beam. Read that again. Elhanan killed Goliath. But 1 Samuel says David killed Goliath. The earlier account is not ambiguous. David strikes him, stands over him, takes his sword, and removes his head. The victory becomes part of David's public identity. Saul asks who he is. The women sing that David has slain his tens of thousands. Goliath's sword later appears in the sanctuary as a remembered object. You cannot quietly assign the same death to Elhanan without creating a collision inside the biblical record. This is why 1 Chronicles chapter 20 becomes so important. Chronicles recounts the same sequence of giant battles, but its parallel line says Elhanan, son of Jair, killed Lahmi, the brother of Goliath the Gittite. Lahmi's spear shaft was like a weaver's beam. Now the pieces fit differently. David killed Goliath. Elhanan killed Goliath's brother Lahmi. The repeated spear description becomes a family echo rather than a contradiction. And the giant face behind Goliath is no longer an invention created for a dramatic image. Chronicles gives him a name, Lahmi. That is the title paid in full. The Bible names giants after Noah's flood, and one was Goliath's brother, not a speculative cousin, not an unnamed bloodline, a warrior named Lahmi in the parallel account of 1 Chronicles. But the solution creates its own question. Which wording came first? Did the Samuel text lose words during copying? Did Chronicles preserve a clearer form of an older report? Or did the chronicler encounter the disturbing Samuel reading and harmonize it with the famous David story by identifying Elhanan's victim as Goliath's brother? We do not possess the original handwritten page of 2 Samuel or 1 Chronicles. We possess manuscript traditions copied across centuries. Ancient Hebrew writing could be visually difficult. Names could be corrupted. Similar phrases could be skipped or repeated. The Samuel wording includes forms that are awkward enough to make textual damage a serious possibility. Chronicles may preserve the cleaner reading, but cleaner does not automatically mean earlier. A later writer can also make a difficult tradition smoother. That is why responsible translations handle the verse differently. Some preserve the traditional Samuel wording and place the Chronicles parallel in a footnote. Some adjust the main text toward the brother reading. The King James Version famously reads that Elhanan killed the brother of Goliath, with words supplied by the translators to harmonize Samuel with Chronicles. In additions that Mark supplied words with italics. The visual signal tells the careful reader those words are not present in the underlying traditional Hebrew line in the same way. This is not evidence that the Bible secretly hid a second David. It is evidence that ancient texts have transmission histories. The more famous the story, the more shocking the collision feels. Yet the collision also preserves something valuable. If Chronicles had not given the parallel, Lahmi might have vanished behind the name Goliath. A copying problem, a clarification, or a harmonization may be the reason modern readers can still see the outline of Goliath's family, and Lahmi is not the last figure in the list. The next warrior is described as an enormous man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits in total. He also is associated with descent from Rapha. He taunts Israel, echoing the behavior of Goliath. Jonathan, the son of David's brother Shimei, kills him. Once again, David is connected to the victory, but he is not the man who strikes the blow. The chapter closes by saying that these 4 were descended from Rapha in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. The 4 in the Samuel sequence are Ishbi-benob, Saph, the warrior attributed to Elhanan, and the six-fingered man killed by Jonathan. Chronicles preserves a parallel list using Sippai where Samuel has Saph, naming Lahmi as Goliath's brother, and recording the six-fingered warrior. Here, the ancestral term Rapha becomes another puzzle. It may refer to a particular ancestor whose descendants form this warrior group. It may function as a collective marker connected to the Rephaim. The wording allows a family association, especially because the men are gathered around Gath and the closing formula links them. But it still does not give us a complete genealogy. We do not know Rapha's parents. We do not receive a list of generations from the Anakim to Goliath. The Bible gives us the end of a line, not every link in it. That ending matters. The giants do not fall in one legendary afternoon. Goliath's death begins a pattern. Ishbi-benob falls to Abishai. Saph or Sippai falls to Sibbekai. Lahmi falls to Elhanan in Chronicles. The six-fingered warrior falls to Jonathan. David's first victory becomes a school of courage. The men who once watched a shepherd face the impossible learn to face the same terror themselves. If this evidence trail is giving you more than the simplified version you grew up with, subscribe now. The buried testament exists for exactly this moment, when one familiar name opens into an entire forgotten record. We compare the parallel books. We keep the hard verse on screen instead of hiding it. And we separate what the Bible says from what later tradition wants it to say. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the next investigation begins where this one must stop, with the missing mechanism between the Nephilim before the flood and the giant peoples after it. Now return to the flood, because this is where the central question becomes unavoidable. If the flood destroyed life outside the ark, why does giant language reappear afterward? The Bible does not give one explicit answer. That absence has produced several theories. One theory argues that Genesis 6 itself predicts a recurrence with the phrase "and also afterward." Under this reading, the event involving the sons of God and human women happened before the flood and in some form happened again later. The later giant peoples would therefore not need an individual pre-flood survivor. They could represent a second outbreak of the same kind of transgression. The strength of this theory is that it takes also afterward seriously without placing a hidden giant on the ark. Its weakness is that the Bible never narrates a second descent or repeats the Genesis 6 episode after the flood. A second theory argues for human continuity through Noah's family. Perhaps the theory says a hereditary trait entered the post-flood world through one of the wives on the ark. This can create a biological bridge without contradicting the list of ark passengers. But the text never identifies such a trait, never names such a wife, and never says that giant ancestry traveled this way. It is possible only in the broad sense that the narrative leaves family backgrounds undescribed. It cannot be presented as a biblical fact. A third approach treats Nephilim and related giant terms as labels applied to later formidable peoples without requiring literal genetic continuity. The spies in Numbers may invoke the oldest language of terror to describe enemies who appear unconquerable. In this reading, Canaan's giants are linked by reputation, body, and mythic memory, not necessarily by an unbroken biological pedigree. This fits the rhetorical nature of the spies' report, but it does not dissolve the later texts that describe Anakim, Rephaim, Og, and the warriors of Gath as concrete historical enemies within the story. A fourth approach sees multiple traditions preserved side by side. Genesis, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Samuel, and Chronicles were not written as a modern genetic study. They preserve memories from different periods, using overlapping terms for legendary and historical enemies. The question of exact descent may be a question the biblical writers never intended to answer. Their concern is theological and national. The land contains enemies who embody impossible strength, yet those enemies fall. Each theory explains part of the pattern. None becomes an explicit verse saying, "This is how giants appeared after Noah." That missing sentence is not a failure of the investigation. It is the boundary of the evidence. A strong case knows where the documents end. What can we say with confidence? We can say that Genesis places Nephilim in the ancient world and includes the difficult phrase "also afterward." We can say that Numbers connects the sons of Anak to Nephilim in the report of the spies. We can say that Deuteronomy remembers tall peoples called Emim and Zamzumim as Rephaim and calls Og a remnant of the Rephaim. We can say that Joshua locates surviving Anakim in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. We can say that Goliath comes from Gath. We can say that Samuel and Chronicles describe additional giant warriors associated with Rapha and Gath. And we can say that Chronicles names Lahmi as Goliath's brother. That is already a remarkable chain. It does not need a fabricated genealogy to become powerful. There is also a deeper reason the giant line gathers around David. In the biblical story, giant killing is tied to kingship. Saul is physically impressive, taller than the people around him, yet he is paralyzed by Goliath. David is smaller and politically invisible, yet he confronts the champion. The contrast exposes the difference between looking like a king and trusting the God of Israel as a king should. Later, when David's own strength fails, his men complete the work. The giant battles become a test of the kingdom David has built. If everything depended on David's arm, the story would end when he grew tired. But Abishai, Sippai, Elhanan, and Jonathan stand up. The victory multiplies. The threatening line from Gath meets a trained community rather than one isolated hero. This makes the final formula in 2 Samuel more important than it first appears. The 4 descendants of Rapha fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. David receives representative credit, but the text remembers the servants' names. The Bible does not collapse every victory into the king. It preserves the network of courage around him. And that may explain why the Elhanan problem survived. A later audience could have erased the awkward line completely. Instead, both forms remained in the biblical tradition. Samuel preserves the shocking Goliath wording. Chronicles preserves Lahmi, the brother reading. The tension forces us to acknowledge that memory can be carried through imperfect copying and parallel correction. The record is not less interesting because it has a scar. The scar shows where the text was handled. For a skeptical viewer, this may be the most important part of the entire case. You do not have to believe giants crossed the flood to recognize what the documents contain. You do not have to accept a supernatural origin theory to see that ancient Israel preserved memories of unusually formidable peoples and organized those memories around identifiable regions and enemies. You do not have to pretend the manuscripts agree perfectly to see that the disagreement itself reveals an older narrative problem. For a believing viewer, the same honesty matters. Faith is not strengthened by making the Bible say what it does not say. The flood narrative does not name a giant survivor. Chronicles does name Lahmi. Samuel does present a textual difficulty. Joshua does connect Anakim remnants to Gath. Keeping those claims at their proper strength allows the real pattern to emerge without fear. The pattern is this: the flood marks an ending, but giant terror appears in the biblical world again. The conquest reduces the Anakim, but a remnant remains in Philistine cities. David kills Goliath, but giant warriors from Gath keep coming. David grows weak, but his servants finish the battles. Every apparent ending leaves one more name until the final 4 fall. The thumbnail captures that pattern in a single impossible reunion. The ark belongs to the ancient judgment. David belongs to the age of kings. Goliath and Lahmi belong to Gath. The open record in David's hands joins the separated eras. The giants are not shown beside the ark because the Bible says they stood there. They are shown beneath its shadow because the question created by the text stretches from Noah to David. How can the oldest terror reappear in a later city, with later names, after the world that knew the Nephilim was judged? The answer is not hidden in one clean genealogy. It is distributed across the canon. Genesis gives the mystery. Numbers gives the frightened identification. Deuteronomy gives the giant peoples and Og. Joshua gives the remnant cities. Samuel gives Goliath and the later warriors. Chronicles gives Lahmi, and Lahmi changes the way you see Goliath. Goliath is usually remembered as a solitary monster, a singular obstacle designed for David's singular faith. Chronicles places him inside a family. His weapon has an echo. His city contains a wider warrior line. His death is not the extinction of the threat. It is the first famous breach in it. That is why Elhanan deserves to be remembered. He stands at the center of the textual collision, almost erased by the fame of David. In one passage, his victory seems to steal David's. In the parallel, his victim becomes the brother of David's enemy. Either way, Elhanan killed a formidable Gittite whose spear was compared to a weaver's beam. His battle belonged to the same cycle of terror and victory. Sippai deserves to be remembered for killing Saph or Sippai. Abishai deserves to be remembered for saving an exhausted David from Ishbi-benob. Jonathan deserves to be remembered for answering the taunt of the 6-fingered warrior. These names turn the story from mythic spectacle into a war remembered through individuals. And the 6-fingered man adds one final physical marker. Unlike the uncertain measurement of Og's bed or the variant height of Goliath, the narrative emphasizes an unusual anatomy, 6 digits on each hand and each foot. Ancient writers often used bodily difference to intensify a warrior's fearsome identity. The point is not that every descendant of Rapha had the same trait. The point is that this final challenger is memorable, visible, and threatening before Jonathan kills him. By the end of the list, the giant line has lost its anonymity. That is the reversal. At the beginning of Israel's journey, the giants make Israel feel like grasshoppers. They are too large to confront and too terrifying to describe calmly. At the end of David's wars, the record can name them, name the men who defeated them, and count the fallen. Fear speaks in exaggeration. Victory writes a list. So did giants survive Noah's flood? If by survive you mean the exact same individuals lived through the water, the Bible does not say that. If you mean giant traditions and giant peoples appear in the biblical narrative after the flood, then yes, unmistakably. The later texts name Anakim, Rephaim, Og, Goliath, Ishbi-benob, Saph, Lahmi, and the six-fingered warrior. But the bridge between the pre-flood Nephilim and those later peoples remains debated. And was Lahmi truly Goliath's brother? 1 Chronicles says he was. The parallel verse in the traditional text of 2 Samuel says Elhanan killed Goliath, creating the textual problem. The brother identification is the cleanest way the canonical parallel preserves both David's victory and Elhanan's. Whether Chronicles retained an older wording or supplied a later clarification cannot be proven with absolute certainty from the surviving evidence. That is the honest verdict. Not a complete bloodline, not a secret passenger on the ark, not a claim that every ancient giant term means exactly the same thing. A documented post-flood giant tradition centered on Canaan and Gath, a named brother of Goliath in Chronicles, and a damaged or disputed line in Samuel that exposes the history of the record itself. Now I want your verdict. Did 1 Chronicles preserve the missing clarification, or did it harmonize a difficult verse after 2 Samuel appeared to give Goliath's death to Elhanan? Write clarification if you think Chronicles preserves the intended brother reading. Write harmonization if you think the later account repaired the problem. Do not answer from instinct. Answer from the evidence we followed. Then subscribe to the Buried Testament. Not because every mystery has a sensational solution, but because some of the strongest discoveries begin when we refuse the easy one. Here, we follow the names, the places, the parallel passages, and the scars left by transmission. If you want the Bible opened with intensity, precision, and no fear of the difficult verse, subscribe now and turn on notifications. The next investigation goes beyond Gath and into the question this record leaves unanswered. Why does Genesis say the Nephilim were there in those days and also afterward? The Book of Enoch offers one framework. Later traditions offer others. But once you compare them with the flood account, the answer becomes far more dangerous than a simple story about giants hiding on the ark. Goliath was not alone. Chronicles names his brother. Samuel preserves the scar. Joshua points to Gath. And across the distance between Noah and David, the Bible leaves a trail large enough to see, but broken enough that no honest reader should pretend the missing links are already filled.